Recently, there was a discussion on the Learn Penang Hokkien Facebook group over whether Penang Hokkien is proper Hokkien. It is difficult to answer such a question unless the people in the discussion are on the same page. But it's not possible to get them on the same page until they have read the page. So I'm going to offer you a more detailed explanation in video form. Please turn on closed caption to follow me in the subtitles, and if you enjoy learning about Penang Hokkien, please subscribe to the Learn Penang Hokkien YouTube channel. Let me start by saying that to have a productive discussion on Penang Hokkien, the participants need sufficient knowledge of the language. Not just knowledge of how to speak the language, but also knowledge of where it came from. Unfortunately, that knowledge is not widespread, and over the course of time has been repeatedly distorted or altered. It is also not possible to obtain such information by making an observation of present-day people in present-day times. All languages are organic. They evolve over time with the movement and mixture of people interacting with the speakers, influencing the vocabulary, pronunciation, and sentence structure. In order to answer whether Penang Hokkien is proper Hokkien, we first need to determine what is proper Hokkien and why is it considered proper Hokkien. Having known that, we also need to decide whether we want to be that. To start, a person needs to know where does Penang Hokkien come from. If a person is able to trace his ancestry back to China, he has more or less missed the boat. In other words, he is part of the latecomers or Singkat, whose forefathers learned the language upon arrival in Penang. His forefather might have originated in Xiamen or Zhuanzhou or Zhangzhou or Dong'an. He could even be a Teochew or Hakka, or in my case a Taishanese. Yet, regardless where his forefather came from, he and his peers ended up speaking a common language which we call Penang Hokkien. What we do need to know is that Penang Hokkien is older than most of the Chinese immigrants. It is even older than Penang itself. It arrived in this region before Penang was established, that is, before 1786. It arrived in a period between history, during the time when the Dutch was the colonial force in Malacca. We do not know much about the people who brought this language over, because they were illiterate refugees similar to the Vietnamese boat people of the 1970s and 80s. They were a mixed bag of people composed largely of the Hokkien from Zhangzhou, but included some Teochew and Hakka as well as Hokkien people from other parts of Fujian province. They did not settle straight away in Penang, but rather they first populated the coastal settlements between Phuket and Kedah, and could even have arrived at Nakhon Si Thammarat, Songkhla, and Kelantan. Fujian province is a largely mountainous province. It has a number of coastal towns that develop into seaports. Due to the mountainous nature of the province, different variants developed through isolation. For hundreds of years, two main seaports were Zhangzhou and Quanzhou. Both of these seaports have their own variant of the Hokkien language, even though they are only 130 kilometers from each other by road, which is just a little more than the distance between Georgetown and Alosta. What is amazing is that from these two closely located seaports came the two main variants of Hokkien that spread across Southeast Asia. For hundreds of years, it was Zhangzhou and Quanzhou that sent out seafaring merchants. They were the masters of the maritime Silk Road. They were the ones who arrived in Malacca during the Sultanate period to trade and subsequently to establish satellite families. Their offspring and descendants in Malacca speak Baba Malay. Because the merchants are usually away, and so were uninvolved in the raising of children, that role went to the mother. And since the mother spoke Malay, the children were raised to speak Malay. In present time, these people are known as the Peranakan. The name Peranakan means they were the local descendants of foreign fathers. It should be noted that for much of history, those who left China to trade were all men. In times of peace, only men were allowed to leave China in order to conduct mercantile trade. These people invariably learned the native language of their ports of call, and if they should form a family there, the children would be speaking the native language. Yet here we are speaking Penang Hokkien. Why do we do so? Tracing the roots of Penang Hokkien, we find that it is largely based on the Changzhou Hokkien. But why is it possible for us to be using a Changzhou variant of Hokkien when the same was not so for the Peranakans? It must have been the presence of women among those who came out of Fujian province, and they came not during time of peace, but one of great turbulence. We now know that these early settlers had to flee Fujian province to escape the upheaval brought on by the collapse of the Ming dynasty and the harsh treatment that came with the Qing dynasty, due in large part to the rebellion by Ming loyalists against Manchu rule centered on Fujian coastal region. This resulted in a decree to clear the coastal area of Fujian province of its population and displacing huge numbers of the people. They were the ones who brought the Changzhou variant to this part of Southeast Asia and the Quanzhou variant to elsewhere in Southeast Asia. During that time of great upheaval, there was a narrow window of opportunity for refugees to flee Fujian province. It resulted in an influx of Hokkien migrants who resettled in Taiwan, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, Siam, Malaya, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and Burma. Unlike the children of the merchants who grew up speaking the native language, the children of the refugees were able to speak the language of their land of origin because of the presence of mothers. These refugees were illiterate boat people. They were not the merchant class which were able to read and write in literary Chinese. Therefore, they were not able to record down their history. However, when things settled down and peace returned to China, the Qing dynasty relaxed the ban on trade, and Fujian merchants once again returned to the ports of call. The history that we know today is based on their perspective. The chronicles left by the merchants that they arrived in Georgetown, that they established clan temples there, were all the truth, but it's a truth based on their perspective. Beyond that truth is an unrecorded history of how whole families of refugees fled Fujian province to arrive in this region even before Penang was established, and they brought their language along. The Changzhou variant of the Hokkien language had existed and was already being spoken by pockets of Chinese settlers along the coastal area of northern Malay Peninsula long before Penang Island was established by Captain Francis Light. Light welcomed people from all over to come to his newly founded Prince of Wales Island, and almost immediately, settlers from the surrounding regions, the Sumatrans, the Kedahans, and the Hokkien-speaking Chinese, all came to populate the newly established Georgetown. But the Hokkien language did not come straight out of China. It came from nearby Kedah. Now, the merchants who returned were once again all men, but that does not matter anymore, considering there were now Hokkien women, descendants of the refugees, within the same settlement. The founding of Penang, and later on the founding of the Strait settlements, enabled Christian missionaries to arrive. Protestant missionaries from England and Catholic missionaries from France replaced earlier Jesuit missionaries of the Portuguese era. In comparison, the Dutch was more interested in winning commerce than in winning souls. Christian missionaries had their sights set on China, but they used Malaya as a stepping stone to get there. It was in places like Penang and Malacca where they did their first outreach to Chinese migrants. The missionaries made a number of astonishing discoveries. They found out, not to much surprise, that the migrants were largely illiterate. They discovered that only a very select group of people could read and write. These people were either the bureaucrats, the merchants, or the priesthood. Everybody else did not need to learn to read or write, and they were able to get on with life just fine. Among the Chinese migrants who were able to read and write, and these were very few in numbers, they were not reading and writing Chinese the same way they speak. In other words, these Chinese people were reading one way, but speaking a different way. As a result, the illiterate class have difficulty to understand their own language when it is read out to them. This phenomenon, which we now know as diglossia, separates the educated from the illiterate. And in the 18th century Georgetown, almost every Chinese you would bump into was a member of the illiterate class. The next astonishing discovery made by the merchants was that while Chinese people who speak different variants of the Hokkien language, if that person is educated, he is able to read the written Chinese text and understand it. So, two different persons, one speaking the Changzhou dialect and the other the Quanzhou dialect, are both able to read and write Chinese texts if they are both educated. Not only that, an educated Cantonese, a Teochew, and a Hakka, they are all able to read the same written Chinese text, even though they will pronounce it in their own way. The missionaries began to appreciate the wisdom of the Chinese language. They saw that this language was more a written communication than a spoken language. That written form enables the mandarins in Beijing to communicate with bureaucrats all over China, even when the bureaucrats spoke a different regional language. The bureaucrats could read the Chinese characters with one pronunciation, then switch to a different pronunciation in spoken form. The same was true of the merchants and the priests. As for the majority, they remained illiterate. Writing communication was a mystery to them. They did not have a need to learn written communication, and it was only at specific occasions that they would need to learn the written form, such as when naming their children. So, their spoken language includes words from the written form but remain largely in the colloquial register. But how do you preach to these people if they could not read the Bible? Getting the majority to learn English in order to read the Bible and to become Christian was a bit of a stretch. So, the other way around was to create a writing system for the spoken language. For the sake of the gospel, the missionaries embarked on a monumental endeavor to create a writing system for the otherwise unwritten language. By the 19th century, the seaports of Changzhou and Quanzhou were in various phases of decline. A new seaport was emerging to replace the two. That was Xiamen, the site of fierce battle between Ming loyalists and Manchu troops. This will become the main seaport for southern Fujian, a position it would hold to this day. Xiamen is located in between Changzhou in the west and Quanzhou in the east. The Hokkien spoken there was a hybrid of the two variants. But by the mid-19th century, Changzhou, located upriver from Xiamen, was silting up and was soon eclipsed by Xiamen. In a way, you can say that Xiamen is like Singapore, while Zhangzhou is like Penang. Due to its importance, the Xiamen form of Hokkien became the prestige form, the form by which a learned person is expected to use. That was the proper Hokkien. But this is to the disadvantage of the folks in Zhangzhou. Just because their pronunciation of Hokkien is different from that in the much younger seaport of Xiamen, now suddenly the Hokkien is not proper Hokkien. It's like a movement developed out of Singapore, and suddenly Singapore Hokkien is proper Hokkien and Penang Hokkien is not. Naturally, a person speaking the Zhangzhou variant does not easily subscribe to this downgrade. Nevertheless, when the missionaries decided to create a Romanized writing system for Hokkien, they chose to use the Xiamen form, which they called the Amoy dialect. The church romanization of the Hokkien language that was created by the missionaries is known in Hokkien as Pet Wei Ji. Its very name tells us that this is in the Xiamen dialect. If it were in the Zhangzhou dialect, it would be pronounced as Pet Wa Ji. The name Pet Wa refers to the spoken language. In similar fashion, the missionaries were also creating Romanized writing systems for other Chinese languages they get into contact with, including Teochew, Hakka, and Cantonese. These are differentiated from Bunhua, the written language. The purpose of those Romanized writing systems was clear: to bring the gospel to the masses. Bunhua, the written language, although it is pronounced in the Hokkien reading pronunciation, is not Hokkien. It's not actually Hokkien. It has a common sentence structure to enable it to be understood across China, even though it is read differently in different places. Based on classical Chinese, and we know it today as literary Chinese, it served the purpose of written communication. Outside the church, the writing system created by the missionaries never gained much of a foothold because there was not much of a need to write Hokkien. The Chinese in Penang, where church romanization was first developed, would rather learn English, which would be the ticket to white-collar employment. If they had trading with China, they might learn literary Chinese. But church romanization, who has time for that? To read the Bible in church romanization, you have two hurdles to leap over. First, you have to learn the writing system, which is not easy. And second, you need to learn pronunciation in the Xiamen dialect. You might as well learn English. But there are those from the Chinese-speaking churches who learn the writing system in order to read God's words, and here's the Bible from that period. This is the Bible in Pet Wei Ji. Although church romanization underwent some tweaks, it was never given a full, complete makeover, so it was never modernized. If you scrutinize the writing system, you will realize that it was created at a time when people handwrite their communication. Most of the illiterate in 19th century Penang do not own a typewriter, so they would write everything down by hand. Therefore, the creators of church romanization have the luxury of introducing unique letters and diacritic marks that do not exist in English. In the span of 200 years since its creation, church romanization has accumulated a substantive body of written work in Hokkien. If you want to write Hokkien, you better write it using this system so that more people can understand you. There were competing systems, but they all fell by the wayside. It was only in the first decade of the 21st century that nationalist sentiments in Taiwan led to the introduction of Taiwanese romanization, a writing system that is based on church romanization, which did away with the unique letters but retained the diacritic marks. albeit placing them on different letters. Taiwanese romanization was adopted a few years after Taiwan's Ministry of Education toyed with the idea of using another competing system, the Taiwanese language phonetic alphabet. It was given a trial run and then put aside in favor of Taiwanese romanization. Meanwhile, on mainland China, the official position is to promote the use of standard modern Mandarin written in simplified Chinese in favor of regional Chinese languages. This wanes the position once held by Xiamen, and so the pole shifts to Taipei as the new flag bearer of the prestige form or of proper Hokkien. But there is not much difference between the Xiamen form of Hokkien and that of Taipei, neither of which is similar to the Changzhou variant or to Penang Hokkien. In present times, there are enthusiasts who are learning to read Penang Hokkien with Chinese characters. The written form is actually a hybrid of using present-day sentence structure on Chinese characters and pronouncing them in Penang Hokkien. It is different from how the Chinese characters were used in the past. In the past, the Chinese characters were pronounced in the literary reading for the purpose of reading literary Chinese. In the present, those characters were pronounced in the Penang Hokkien variant of the colloquial reading for the purpose of modern communication. This movement garners some following among hardcore enthusiasts, but has remained largely unknown and unlearned by the majority of modern-day casual users of Penang Hokkien. At Learn Penang Hokkien, we don't have such lofty goals. Our mission is to make our language accessible to all. Speakers of Penang Hokkien were illiterate in the past, and they are still illiterate in the present. To impart literacy outside formal classroom is a mammoth task. The goal to preserve, develop, and modernize the language so that we can prolong its lifespan outweighs other considerations. That means making it as easy as possible to learn. This includes simplifying the tone system and using a romanized form based on mainstream education in Penang. Learning to write without attending classes is not easy. Some effort is required, but it will be easier than other ways. Now, returning to the question of is Penang Hokkien proper Hokkien, we need to question whether any variant of Hokkien is proper Hokkien. Every living language will absorb words from surrounding languages. The Hokkien existing in Penang has picked up words from English and Malay as well as from Mandarin and Cantonese. In Changzhou, where it came, the language has also absorbed many words with the Xiamen pronunciation, while in Taipei, many words and way of speaking has entered it from Mandarin. Should we therefore conclude that proper Hokkien does not exist or no longer exists, or should we simply accept that the Hokkien spoken is proper in its respective location?